Good evening, everybody. It's really a great privilege to have been asked to deliver the keynote address in my last year as co-dean of the law school and as co-president of the Canada-US Law Institute. You're actually in for a double helping of Scharf this evening, as you heard, because I'll also be performing. I play the guitar and sing with our law school band, Raising the Bar. That's spelled R-A-Z-I-N-G. The law students came up with that name. They said it was subversive. And Kelsey DeMonte, who I see right there, she designed our logo. It is a flaming scales of justice. So that's what it means. This conference, which is focusing on the economics of human rights, corresponds with the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we did put on each of your chair a little mini version of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know how all those constitutional law professors and litigators always pull out their pocket constitution? Well, now you international lawyers can do that with the Universal Declaration. Oh, and I notice on the back that it's branded Case Western Reserve. So, my remarks tonight will focus on the unique role that this law school has played in the struggle for international human rights and accountability over the last 75 years. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights arose from the horrors of the Holocaust. The leading perpetrators were brought to justice before history's first international criminal tribunal at Nuremberg, Germany. Prior to the negotiation of the charter and judgment of the Nuremberg Tribunal, there was no such thing as international human rights. What a country did to its own citizens in its own territory was no other country's business but that country's. That all changed with the judgment of the Nuremberg Tribunal, which established the principle that state officials could be prosecuted for the atrocities that they commit at home and abroad. That principle made it possible for the international community, under the leadership of U.S. Permanent Representative to the UN, Eleanor Roosevelt, to agree on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration paved the way for the negotiation of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And together, these three instruments are considered the International Bill of Rights. While global enforcement has been uneven, their impact is undeniable. They have been cited in numerous international and domestic court cases in the United States and throughout the world. Now, most of you know that this law school has had a special connection to the Nuremberg Tribunal, and you've heard about Henry King tonight. But what you might not know is that it began 20 years before Henry King's arrival at our doors. One of Robert Jackson's senior prosecutors at Nuremberg was Sidney Jacoby. He joined our faculty after the Nuremberg trial, and he taught civil procedure here for 20 years. Now, Henry King was at the time of Nuremberg the youngest Nuremberg prosecutor. He was just 2 years older than our third-year law students here today. And he ended up following in Professor Jacoby's footsteps, teaching international arbitration and serving as the director of the Canada-US Law Institute here for 30 years before his passing in 2009. In his final years, Henry was also proudly serving as Honorary Consul General of Canada to Ohio, a position that is now occupied by his protege, Dan Utso. Dan, you want to stand up for a sec? It was really Henry who made the annual conference what it is today. He recruited the co-chairs of the CUSLI Executive Committee, and Governor Blanchard, thank you for being with us today. Jim Peterson, who you saw on Zoom, thank you for joining us that way. He also recruited many of the current members. He recruited the co-sponsors. In the early years of this conference, he would make phone calls and make sure that he would fill the room. Governor Blanchard asked me to make sure this room was filled, and I did the same thing, I can tell you. Are you satisfied with our group here? So 23 years ago, Henry recruited another war crimes specialist, yours truly, to follow in his footsteps here at the school. I had met Henry when I was attorney advisor for UN Affairs at the US Department of State, when I was working on the creation of the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal. And at that time, we spoke at length with Henry King and Ben Ferenz and Whitney, what's his last name? The one, Harris, thank you, at Washington University, the three surviving members of the American delegation at Nuremberg. And they gave us all kinds of wonderful guidance. And we basically dusted off the old Nuremberg Tribunal statute, updated it with modern human rights law, and created the modern tribunals statute for Yugoslavia. That tribunal statute was then replicated for the Rwanda tribunal. Very similar statute was used for the special court for Sierra Leone, and the ICC looks an awful lot like that statute. Now, after I arrived at CASE, Henry supported my efforts to launch our International Tribunal Internship Program and a summer abroad program in the Netherlands that focused on international criminal law, and an international criminal law LLM degree, and the War Crimes Watch e-newsletter, and the Cox Center Award for Advancing Global Justice. And finally, what is now called the Henry King War Crimes Research Office, whose assistance to international tribunals was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. And at that time, our own Professor Jim Johnson, who I see right there, was the lead trial attorney at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. His supervising attorney was David Crane. And David and Jim and his colleagues were inundated by a lot of really difficult legal issues. And they didn't have the time or resources that we had at our school. So we entered into an MOU with them, and my students deep dived into it. And they worked on issues like, could the head of state of Liberia, Charles Taylor, be prosecuted in a hybrid court? And it was clear after Nuremberg that he could be prosecuted in an international court because there's no head of state immunity at an international court. But what about a court that is partly international and partly national? And that took a lot of research. We looked at the issue of whether somebody could be convicted of recruiting and using child soldiers, which had never been prosecuted before an international tribunal up to that time. And we looked at 50 other legal issues that they assigned to us. And in the end, David Crane nominated our program for the Nobel Peace Prize. Our students, for their research, got that recognition. So that's pretty cool. Now, Henry was a master of organizing conferences and expert meetings. And through the years, he helped me pull together important academic gatherings on cutting-edge issues, such as torture and the war on terrorism, resulting in something called the Cleveland Principles in the Treatment of Detainees. That was a document signed by over 500 academics around this country at the time when America was holding hundreds of sometimes innocent people and waterboarding them at Guantanamo Bay. Now, Henry also encouraged me to spend a sabbatical as an assistant to the chief prosecutor of the Cambodia Genocide Tribunal. And he advised me when I trained the judges for the trial of Saddam Hussein. As my mentor, I think he would have been extremely proud when I became the first American to present an amicus argument before the appeals chamber in the International Criminal Court last year. When I became dean 11 years ago, I took a page from Henry's book, and I recruited yet another war crimes expert by the name of Jim Johnson, who I just mentioned to you, to take our program to the next level. Jim, I'm really glad you came tonight. You had no idea I was going to say all these nice things. I met Jim when he was the chief trial counsel in the trial of Liberian President Charles Taylor before the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And I can tell you that Jim and his colleagues became household names when they called supermodel Naomi Campbell to the stand. I'm going to tell you this story briefly. Jim says I always exaggerate this, but I think it's pretty much actual. So basically, it's close. Yeah, it's been a couple of years. But basically, Charles Taylor's up there saying, look, I didn't give any weapons to the rebels in Sierra Leone who were committing all of these atrocities, and I didn't get anything from them. I've never heard of blood diamonds. That's not my thing. So they call Naomi Campbell to the stand, and Naomi says, yes, they say, tell us about when you met the defendant. And she goes, well, I went to a party at Nelson Mandela's house in South Africa, and in comes the Liberian president with his swagger, and he comes up to me and he says, Naomi, you are this beautiful supermodel. I really appreciate you, so I have something for you. He reaches in his pocket and he pulls out a rough cut diamond. And it is a blood diamond, and he gives it to her, and in the end, she turns it over to authorities, and that's the diamond that convicted Charles Taylor. And so, good job, Jim Johnson. Now, since Jim's arrival, he has organized the International Humanitarian Law Roundtable at the Chautauqua Institute, and that is a retreat how many of our students here have been to that? Look at that. Okay, that's a retreat that our students get to go to, and all of the major international prosecutors and their staff members and academics get together at Lake Chautauqua at this institute in this old hotel, the Athenaeum. It's one of the two last remaining giant wooden hotels. The other one's the one at Mackinac Island. And we go there, and it's just a group thing, and we talk about the big issues facing the international tribunals. And they see it as their annual retreat. They love it, and our students get this opportunity to interact with them, and some of them end up getting jobs through that. And our band, which you're going to hear tonight, plays there, and it's really quite extraordinary. If anybody in this room wants to go in August, I can get you invited. It's really something. In addition, Jim created the Yemen Accountability Project, which is laying the groundwork for the prosecution of perpetrators of atrocities committed in the Yemen civil war. And here's another story. So we've all heard a little bit about the Houthis the last couple of months because they've been lobbing missiles at shipping in the region. And then just last week, they sent some missiles over or drones over to Israel. But before that, hardly anybody was paying attention to what was going on in Yemen. And the Yemen crisis is horrible. I mean, the things that are going on there are rivaling what are going on in Gaza, in Syria, in Sudan, in Myanmar, and in the Ukraine. It's really bad, but nobody's paying attention to it. Why is that? Because one side is being supported by Saudi Arabia, who has a lot of friends, including the United States. The other side is being supported by Iran, and nobody wants to mess with this. So there is no international effort to document this until Jim Johnson said, we should do it here. And so when our students come to our law school, they often say, I want to go to a place where I can have an impact after I graduate on the world. And Jim Johnson said, you can have an impact while you're here. And so he asked for volunteers, and over 50 students, mostly 1Ls, volunteered to be part of the Yemen Accountability Project. They've been doing this now for 6 years, and it's averaged 50 to 60 students a year. They just published their, I want to say, 5th white paper, and also they've been creating a crime base and a narrative, and basically all the tools that are required for either universal jurisdiction prosecutions in Europe or some future international tribunal to prosecute these crimes. How many of the students here have participated in the Yemen Accountability Project? Look at that. So congratulations to you guys. You know, I think Henry really would have enjoyed working with Jim, and he would have loved the topic of this year's CUSLI conference. Building on Henry's foundation, our human rights program is now recognized as one of the best in the world, and our international law program last year was ranked number 10 by U.S. News and World Report, something we've been clawing our way up to all these years since Henry was here, and we finally got to the promised land, the top 10. Our success wouldn't be possible but for the incredible generosity of our alums. And I think, you know, one of the things that Jessica Berg and I are going to be remembered for in terms of our success is it turned out, to our surprise, we were pretty good fundraisers. So in the last 11 years, we've raised $80 million for this school, and we doubled the... we doubled the school's endowment, and some of those went to the international law program, and in particular to human rights work. So for example, I want to do a shout out for Bruce Klatsky, who just recently gave us $500,000 to make it possible for our Journal of International Law to be given to every American international law professor so that it is likely to be cited as, you know, one of the most cited journals in all of the country or the world. How many of you are part of the Journal of International Law? Look at that, okay. So, you know, did I fill the room, Jim? And then there's Tim Geis. You know, Jim Johnson and I went to Tim Geis, and he has agreed to give us $10,000 a year to support the Yemen Accountability Project. This brings experts in to meet with our students, and it allows our students to interact with the people who eventually might be prosecuting. And then there's Austin Fragaman. Austin graduated from here and created the biggest immigration law firm in the world, and he had this idea that you could have a firm that did nothing but immigration law. Well, toward the end of his career, I said, you know, we do immigration law at our clinic, and we'd like to have a distinguished lecturer named after you, and we'd like to have money to support the growth of what we do, because we have a track record of saving people in asylum and refugee cases second to none. How many of you have done the clinic that does asylum and refugee immigration law? Anybody? Okay, well, you missed the boat on that one. That is incredible work. When you come to law school and you can actually save people from torture or death if they are sent home to a place where they'll be persecuted. So the last great project that Henry engaged in was the effort to get the negotiators of the Rome Diplomatic Conference to include the crime of aggression in the statute of the International Criminal Court. And he succeeded by going to Rome and getting the negotiators to have a reference to the crime of aggression. But it said it's not in the statute until the statute is amended, and it would take 10 years for that to happen. In 2010, I was at Kampala when the countries in the world agreed to that amendment. And they added the crime of aggression to the statute. It was a great symbolic victory. But you know what? Because of countries, including the United States, they put a whole bunch of barriers up. They were afraid of the crime of aggression. And it's those barriers that are currently preventing Vladimir Putin from being prosecuted by the International Criminal Court for the worst of his crimes. You may know that the ICC has indicted Putin for the crime of stealing children from the Ukraine and having them adopted in Russia. And just last month, there was a subsequent indictment that wasn't really in the press, so this might be news to some of you. It indicted his major general and his major admiral for indiscriminate shelling and attacks against civilians. But Putin should be indicted for the crime of aggression. That's the crime that Henry thought was most important about Nuremberg. And the United Nations is currently considering a proposal which is supported by Canada and by European allies to create an ad hoc tribunal outside of the ICC to make sure that Putin stands trial for that crime. Now, Henry always ended every speech with something inspirational. And you who know him know that he used to pound his fists on the table while making that final point. So my final fist-pounding point in Henry's honor has to do with supporting Ukraine. After Russia invaded Ukraine, It began a campaign of war crimes and crimes against humanity that rivaled some of the worst atrocities that Henry prosecuted at Nuremberg. The International Criminal Court, as I mentioned, has indicted Russian President Vladimir Putin and his top military and naval commanders for war crimes in the Ukraine. The International Bar Association recently asked me to lead a team of experts to train Ukrainian prosecutors and investigators on how to prosecute international environmental war crimes. Because Russia's not just attacking the people of Ukraine, it's attacking the environment. And so we're going to be going out to Krakow, Poland in October and spending time working through that. And part of the reason I was asked to do that is because my work with the Saddam Hussein case involved the only other time in history that a leader or any official was indicted and convicted of crimes of environmental war crimes. In the case of Saddam Hussein, you might know the story. He was one day traveling through a little town called Dujal, and someone tried to shoot at him. And maybe they didn't even try to shoot at him. Maybe it was just like a car backfiring, but he thought that they tried to shoot at him. And so he ordered that the city be destroyed and all the people be killed. But that's not all he did. He destroyed all of the date farms within a 100 miles radius, and he salted the earth so that nothing would ever grow there again. That's what he did to a town because he was mad, because he thought that they tried to kill him. Not only that, but the Southern Marsh Arabs had the audacity to try to do an uprising. So they were dependent on their version of the Everglades, and he cut off all the water supplies, and they dried up, and they died by the hundreds of thousands. So he was convicted, and his subordinates were convicted of those environmental war crimes. Now, what Russia's been doing is horrible too. Not only have they been attacking indiscriminately, but they've been doing things purposely to destroy the environment. For example, whenever they occupy areas in the Ukraine and there are mines, well, Russia doesn't want the mines. They have their own minerals. They don't want the competition. But what they do want to do is destroy the environment, so they flood the mines. And when you flood mines, you create environmental disasters that spread out for hundreds of miles with toxicity that is almost impossible to reverse. They also attacked the major dam and flooded downstream major farms and cities and towns and killed hundreds of thousands and destroyed the land. They've been putting so many landmines in the Ukraine that there are more there now than the DMZ in between North and South Korea. And their landmines are plastic, so they're almost impossible to find with metal detectors. For the next 10, 20, 30 years, farmers and little children are going to have their legs blown off because of the way Russia is conducting this war. And the worst thing that I just recently heard about was that they have been attacking the marine life in the ocean just off the coast. And hundreds of thousands of dolphins have been washing up. And there are pictures online that you can see of basically Putin attacking Flipper. What's that about? But that's what we're going to be prosecuting. Now, President Putin was banking on fracturing the West, when in fact, the opposite has occurred with unprecedented resolve. Canada and 50 other NATO allies have joined the United States in freezing Russian financial assets, imposing sanctions on Russia, and providing vital economic and military aid to the Ukraine in its time of need. When Russia repeatedly used its veto at the Security Council to prevent any resolutions, the United States and Canada and their allies utilized a long dormant procedure. For 50 years, it hadn't been used. It was called the Uniting for Peace mechanism. And what that does is it says when the Security Council is paralyzed by the veto, you can go to the General Assembly, and if you can get a 2/3 vote, the General Assembly can act. And they have acted. They passed the first resolution condemning Russia's crime of aggression, and they called it the crime of aggression. Next, they passed a resolution saying that when Russia had plebiscites in these occupied areas, they were invalid and had no international legal effect. Then they passed a resolution, probably most extraordinary of all, that removed Russia from the Human Rights Council. Then they passed a resolution that created a registry so that people in Ukraine who have lost their land, their loved ones, who have been injured, can register what happened to them. And all of those assets that have been frozen may one day go to compensate those individuals and rebuild the Ukraine. There is currently, and of course, we've got the most famous person when it comes to asset freezing and seizures here in the room with us. He was introduced before, but I want to do another shout out to Rick Newcomb, who was director of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the sanctions guy, for over 30 years. Did I have that right? 18 years? All right, I like to get it right. 18 years, still really impressive. I met him when I was at the State Department, and that was 30 years ago. So, so the world is now looking at how can they use these assets to make the Ukraine whole again. Now, with the US and Canada's support, Ukraine has been doing pretty well in its war against the Goliath that is Russia. They've reclaimed 2/3 of their eastern territory that Russia initially occupied. They valiantly have fought Russia to a standstill for 2 years. But the Ukraine is running out of ammunition, and Russia is biding its time. And now our Congress is dithering, with some members expressing the view that Putin doesn't present a threat beyond Ukraine. This isn't an interest of ours, or as Ross Perot would say, we don't have a dog in that fight. At Nuremberg, Henry King saw firsthand the price the world paid for failing to recognize Hitler's expansionist ambitions. If he were still here with us, he would raise his voice in moral outrage at the failure to continue to aid Ukraine. He would call for action. He would say, we can and must do better. Well, thank you all for being here, for listening to me as I channeled Henry King. Thank you for coming after we're done here for dessert. It's gonna be make your own sundaes, and we have the bar open, and raising the bar, the band will be playing right behind there. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, guys. Do you want me to do a couple of questions? Like 2? Yeah, go ahead. Okay. All right, well, we have time for a couple of questions. So if you have any question about human rights law, international law, or anything in my field, I'm happy to chat with you about it. I should tell you that I was up at 3 o'clock this morning because I was giving a lecture in Austin, Texas, at University of Texas, and I had to get back here, and that was the only way to do so. So if my answers get a little loopy, you know, I can't control that. But anyway, anybody? Yes.
What's your role in the band? What do you do?
What do I do in the band? You'll have to come over and see. I play the guitar and I sing. And I'll tell you the thing about our band. So we have students who are extraordinarily good singers, good musicians. And then we have me, and we have some faculty that are pretty decent. But my co-dean, Jessica Berg, was once asked, you know, is Scharf any good? Because he's been playing in this band for a long time. You'd think I'd get better. And she says, let's just say he makes up for any lack of quality with his enthusiasm. So, yeah, that's what you'll see.
So my other question is, when you look at history, world history, whatever, who are your heroes?
Who are my heroes?
Henry King.
You know, I'm going to tell you a story that, if you guys don't know it, it should resonate with you. You mentioned that, did you go to Bowdoin College? All right. My hero went to Bowdoin College. He was a professor there. His name was Lawrence Joshua Chamberlain. I have his bust in my office. And if you ever saw the movie Gettysburg or read the book Killer Angels, you know what this man did. But if you didn't, I want to tell you it because it will inspire you for the rest of your life. So he's a professor of rhetoric, a law professor in essence. He has a bunch of students, and during the Civil War, they didn't have to enlist. They were, you know, wealthy. They could have hired somebody else to go in their their place. But they felt that they should. So they did, and they made the long march from Maine down to Gettysburg, and they were the 20th Maine. There were only 300 of them. They arrived at Gettysburg after the first day of fighting. Now, after the first day, it was kind of a standstill. The North had this ridge called Cemetery Ridge, and at the end of it was Little Round Top. It was a bald mountain, and nobody thought to go up there with the cannons. The South are on the other side, and they are looking at Little Round Top, and they're thinking, if we can get our artillery up there, we can rain hell on the North, and we will win this battle. And if we win this battle, we actually might win the whole Civil War, because both France and England were saying, if you could only win a battle in the North, we'll talk about recognizing you. So Gouverneur Morris, who's the general in charge of the Army Corps of Engineers, also looks up there. And he says, we got to get people up there. But everybody was exhausted from the fighting. And here comes the 20th Maine with their professor in the lead, Colonel Chamberlain. And he says, thank you for being here. Go up on that mountain. And listen, Chamberlain, you've got to hold that at all costs. You cannot retreat no matter what. And Chamberlain, as a professor, understood the stakes. So he goes up there with his 300 college kids, and the first wave in the morning of 1,000 Southerners come after him. But they've got the high ground, they've got rocks, and they're shooting down. So they only lost 100 people, and they killed 1,000. It's pretty good odds. But then the South sent another 1,000 up after them. Again, they shot down from behind their boulders. They lost another 100. Now they're down to 100 guys, and another 1,000 are coming. It's even worse than that. They didn't have any bullets left. And so he sat down with his troops. He cuddled them together, and he drew a pinwheel, and he said, we're going to fix bayonets, we're going to yell the rebel yell to confuse them, and we're going to do a pinwheel because we don't have enough people to cover our flank. And we'll see what happens, but we can't retreat. And this was the first bayonet charge since Napoleonic times. Well, it worked. He bought enough time, and he was injured. His brother who fought with him was injured, but he looked over his shoulder and he looked up at the top of Little Round Top, and now there were 10,000 US troops occupying that field. And after that, the battle was over, really. The war was over. When Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, he had to give his sword over as a ceremonial token. And he said, I want to give it to Lawrence Joshua Chamberlain because I think he was the most important person on your side of the war. And he was also the first person to get the Medal of Honor in the Civil War. I went back up to Bowdoin because there's a little museum for him, and it is incredible. But anyway, if a professor can convince his troops to fight to the last man by educating them, not yelling at them, then we're in the right profession. That's why he's my hero. So, thanks for that, Jim. All right, let's just call it a day. Yeah. Thanks.